The second round of the 2025 Supercars Championship has wrapped up on the streets of Melbourne. Supercars once again supporting the F1 at the Australian Grand Prix. And in terms of the tin top racing, it was action-packed. We had some crazy racing as we've come to expect around Melbourne, some carnage, some controversy, and some great underdog performances as well. They're just a few of the things I'm going to chat about today in my round review. So let's jump into it. Now, there is so much we could delve into, but one of the first items I want to touch on is actually one of the bad news stories from the weekend, and that was the horrendous start for Blanchard Racing, or should I say, continued horrendous start. They had a rough run in Sydney with their two teammates coming together in qualifying, as we covered in that round review, and this weekend it didn't get off to much of a better start, with James Courtney putting it in the wall at turn 5 in a very big way. That caused significant damage to the car. He was out for the entire of Friday's running. That meant he missed the first two qualies of the weekend, which set the grid for those first two races, and the first race itself as well. So Blanchard Racing team, a real rough start to the season for those guys. In the cool drive car though, we did see Aaron Cameron replace Aaron Love, and while he got boxed around a little bit, as you'd come to expect from someone entering the main game full-time for the first time, I do think he showed some pretty promising pace considering he's had a bit going on. He was parachuted in quite late. He's racing with a broken toe, and on one of the days his family home was actually under threat by a bushfire. So that guy's had a fair bit going on, and all that considered, I think he can look at Melbourne as a fairly solid start to his full-time supercars career. It was also pretty rough running down at Tickford after a dominant weekend in Sydney. Their two guys qualified near enough towards the back. This was a particular surprise for championship contender Cameron Waters, tipped to be one of the big challengers this year. He had to really fight his way back in those races, back towards the front half of the field and those larger point hauls. Now, he did a great job getting through the pack quickly and cleanly, but Tickford can't afford to give their drivers too many rescue jobs following qualifying this year, because there's only so much you can race your way back towards the front without your luck running out. The new final structure for the championship might help Tickford in the sort of swings in performance that they seem to have from round to round, but yes, they do need some sort of consistency if they do want to be challenging Red Bull come the end of the year. A more positive story though was Matt Stone Racing. There's just something about Albert Park and that team that clicks. It was a really good weekend for that squad, especially after last year where they seem to have lost their way after a fairly promising start to the Gen 3 era. Cameron Hill got himself a podium on one of those races and backed it up with his maiden win the very next day in a MSR 1-2. And Nick Percat put on a great show as well. He was hanging onto a podium for dear life after his power steering failed on the final lap of one of those races. It was a hell of a drive from him, trying to fight off two Shell V-Power Racing Mustangs behind him with a lot of good racecraft with a failing machine under him. It was thoroughly entertaining, exactly the kind of supercars action I like to see. One of the most controversial moments from this weekend was that big turn 5 collision between Ryan Wood and Jack Le Brocq, which resulted in huge damage for that Erebus Camaro. Ryan Wood was deemed at fault for the incident, wholly at fault in fact, and given a big penalty, a pit lane penalty, which is one of the more severe punishments the stewards can throw at a driver. And in this new age of letting the drivers race harder, it certainly caught the attention of fans, not just here in Australia, but from ex-Supercars drivers around the world. Scott McLaughlin and Shane Van Gisbergen both taken to social media to express their dissatisfaction with that penalty. Now, I've really struggled, to be honest, to come to a conclusion on this incident and where I stand on it, purely because we didn't really get many good camera angles. And one of the controversies attached to this incident was that some judicial camera footage was actually put on social media that shouldn't have been and was quickly taken down. But from the broadcast cameras, which are the only cameras I've been able to see up to recording this video, it is really tricky. From the trackside shot that looks at the cars as they exit that turn 5, it looks pretty damning for Wood because he's not up very far alongside at the point of contact. Normally the cars have to be sort of up to the B pillar on the other car, or roughly halfway up. That said though, when you look at the still camera from Ryan Wood looking backwards as he's making the move, it does look like he was pretty much fully alongside, or at least a good amount alongside, at the apex, which is normally where you start calling if a driver should or shouldn't be where they are. But overall, I do feel like this penalty was a little bit overkill, particularly in this new age of letting the drivers race harder. Of course, you can't let people just take each other out, but I don't think that's what Ryan Wood really intended to do here. For me, the move appeared to be on its lap 1. We know that corner is awkward at the best of times. We've seen so many incidents there in supercars over the years. And for me, the real kicker in that incident that made it so much worse was just the interlock of wheels. Well, as I said, I haven't seen enough to come to a real confident conclusion. My overall feeling is that some sort of penalty might have been deserved for Wood, but a pit lane penalty just seemed far too harsh considering the circumstances. Daniel's comment here is a really nice segue into my next talking point, where he says it was a really good weekend to watch. Lots of action and drama and highlights everywhere. It was just a shame the 4th race got cancelled, and it was a big disappointment, wasn't it? A bitter note to end the weekend, especially because Albert Park, as we expected, really did deliver for supercars again this year. We had some fantastic racing, underdog performances, a bit of controversy. It was just really entertaining every time the supercars were on track. So it was all the more disappointing when we woke up on Sunday morning, saw those horrendous conditions, and supercars not getting their final race in. And that, of course, brought up the age-old debate: should they have raced, should they have not? Lots of split opinion on social media. And I must admit, from what I saw, the conditions to me reminded me a lot of Taupo last year, that first race that weekend that was pretty darn miserable. But Melbourne is a different kettle of fish. It did seem like the weather conditions were deteriorating. Obviously, it's a street circuit. The walls are so much closer. And it's a really high-speed track as well. So that no doubt all factored into the decision not to run that race. It is disappointing though, because you do hope that when you've got a grid of open wheelers, that the tin top cars are the ones more versatile and able to race through those harsh conditions. And for the fans trackside who were sitting out there all morning in the rain, it must have been pretty frustrating. So for me, I'm pretty split opinion on this. The drivers all seem to back the decision, and ultimately they're the ones who know the conditions best. But yeah, it would have been good to get that final race, and especially in the wet weather, just to put the icing on the cake. And let's finish up with a very big picture idea, something that's been reported in the days after this year's AGP, and it could be a silver bullet for some of the pains that a lot of fans have, including 2 of the comments I got from you guys. First one here from Michael saying, I gave the weekend a 1-star rating because I can't really comment. I get absolutely zero coverage without paying here in the States because Supercars did not post any highlights or anything available to the general public, and it's really disappointing. Second comment from Robert saying, love the weekend, but Supercars with 19 laps is ridiculously short. Would have preferred 2 races with pit stops. And all this, of course, is tied to the fact Supercars are on F1 support bill when it comes to the AGP, which impacts not only the scheduling, but significant complications when it comes to the broadcast rights as well. Now, both of these could be addressed by Supercars having their own dedicated weekend at the Australian Grand Prix, the Albert Park Street Circuit. And that possibility has been reported by Auto Action over recent days. The AGP organisers want to expand the length of their events over 2 weekends, with the first weekend being Australian focused and Supercars one of the potential contenders to run that show. And then of course the more traditional Australian Grand Prix weekend with F3, F2 and an F1 on the second weekend. Now this one presents a real interesting situation for Supercars. I feel like I can argue quite strongly for and against this all at the same time, and we'll jump into some of the reasons for to begin with. Firstly, if they had their own dedicated weekend, it would certainly solve our issue when it comes to scheduling and running time on the track. Supercars get a lot of action on the Thursday, but when it comes to the rest of the weekend, when you've got F1 and the other support categories in the mix, Supercars often do have their races cut short, or as we saw on Sunday, not happen at all. It's such a shame because Albert Park, as I've said, just puts on such great racing action for Supercars, and it feels like we only just get a little taste of it every time Supercars do roll around to the Australian Grand Prix. If they had their own dedicated weekend, we could see some proper full-length Supercars action and get some of the other support categories out there as well. I would Love to see the V8 Super Utes trying to throw those things around the Albert Park street circuit. It would also go a long way in solving those TV rights complications that cause so many headaches, especially for fans outside of Australia. It's a real bone of contention. Currently, because Supercars are a support act on the F1 bill, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but Supercars basically have their hands tied on sharing any of the racing action. They can't even put highlights out of the racing once it's complete. It really does feel like lunacy how that agreement is structured, and moving away from it even partially so they've got a bit more freedom to bring fans such exciting racing that does happen there would be a good move. And if you jump into the economics of it all, it does seem to make a bit of sense. The AGP has become incredibly competitive to get tickets for over recent years, and very expensive as well. So by expanding the event out over 2 weekends, you might have a chance to relieve some of that congestion and demand there is for tickets. No doubt the F1 weekend is always going to be crazy popular and expensive, but at least with Supercars on their own dedicated weekend, you might be able to distribute some of that demand and also give people a cheaper option to get trackside at Albert Park. And for the AGP organizers who spend a lot of money building this venue every year, it gives them the opportunity to double dip as well. There are, however, a lot of cons, and there's no doubt Supercars would lose some of its visibility among the casual fan base if they were to go to their own dedicated weekend, which is often suggested as a big perk of them racing on the F1 support bill. I've known a couple of people in my friend circle that have gone over to the AGP who have got into F1 over recent years, didn't really know much about Supercars, but while they're waiting for the F1 action, they've seen them on track and thoroughly enjoyed what they saw. Now granted, admittedly, they haven't gone on to become avid Supercars fans, but their awareness of the sport and their respect for it really does seem to have gone through the roof since they've seen those cars on track. If Supercars are on their own dedicated weekend, that sort of cursory awareness among more casual fans and potentially international ones as well, you would think it wouldn't be anywhere near as powerful. On a similar note, I do wonder if having a dedicated weekend would remove a bit of a calling card, a bit of a negotiation tactic for Supercars teams when they're trying to bring prospective sponsors on board. Now, we all know the grandstands empty out a little bit when F1's not on track, but no doubt teams being able to say to potential sponsors that they're racing on the same track, the same weekend as F1, one of the world's biggest and most successful sports at the moment, surely that's got to be a real valuable thing for them, and I do wonder if they'll miss that draw card if they had their own weekend. Speaking of the size and success of F1, we do know that Supercars have been trying to buddy up with F1 over recent months. It does sound like they're trying to get on the support bill of more F1 races around the world. And currently Supercars have a foot in the door with F1 by being on the support bill at the Australian Grand Prix, able to show off the great racing they can produce, especially on some of these bigger, faster, wider tracks that F1 goes to. And if they do want to really keep pursuing this international expansion with F1, which admittedly has been quite quiet over the past few months, it would seem crazy for them to remove the one foot in the door they have right now at the Australian Grand Prix. And then the final reason why I think this might not be such a good move for Supercars is the risk that it could look like a failure even if the event does go quite well. The Albert Park Street Circuit and the facilities around it, it's designed for F1 levels of fans. Hundreds of thousands of people pouring through the gate. And as a result, we've got massive grandstands that Supercars unfortunately probably would struggle to fill, especially if everyone's pouring their money and attention into the AGP the following weekend. Even if Supercars pulled in a very respectable crowd that's sort of on par with other events they hold around Australia and New Zealand, it might give the appearance of being a failure because of empty seats in those massive grandstands. To the casual viewer and to those just tuning in, flicking through TV, it might not be the best first appearance for the sport. I've spent quite a bit of time on the negatives there, purely because they're a bit more nuanced and need a bit more discussion, but overall, I would like to see this tried. Supercars are having their own dedicated weekend of racing around the Albert Park Street Circuit, and you guys seem pretty positive about it as well. 77% of you in favor on the poll I put up recently. But that big picture thinking is probably a good opportunity to wrap up the round review. Lots to talk about both on and off the track, and of course we've got New Zealand coming up in just a few weeks. I'll be covering that with my round preview and review as always, so if you want to show some support here on the channel, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, treat people like your trackside while you're down there in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.